With Istio, you can apply what we call authorization policies that are going to be enforced by the target service. So you define the authorization policies, and the control plane is going to configure this proxy in each pod to enforce them. But that means that if you have like hundreds of services, you need to define like hundreds of authorization policies, which can be quite complicated. But in Gloo Platform, we have this notion of the workspaces that we can use as a natural boundary, so that we can tell the platform, I want zero trust to be applied in the Bookinfo workspace, so that automatically the platform is going to generate all the corresponding Istio authorization policies, so that only the services that are part of this workspace and the one that we have exported can communicate together. So let's take a look at that. So if first of all I try right now to access from a pod that is not in the mesh, so the one that's called not in the mesh, I try to access the review service that is in the Bookinfo workspace. Right now it's going to work because I didn't define any security policies to prevent that. So I can, you see, I get a 200 response code. And obviously that's the same if I try from a service that is in the mesh but not in the workspace. I can also access the review service, because by default any service can communicate together, even if they are not in the mesh. If they are in the mesh, you have mutual TLS by default. If they are not in the mesh, there is no mutual TLS, but they can communicate. And this is because we don't have any peer authentication object, which is, you can see in the documentation as well, the way it works. Basically, you can have multiple modes in this peer authentication. By default, it's permissive, which is what I have just described. You can make it strict by creating a peer authentication object in the Istio system namespace. Then only mutual TLS traffic is allowed. But again, the problem is that you always have like some exception in your cluster, so you don't really apply this strict mode because of that. And if you want to do that more gradually, then you need to go and create peer authentication object in many different places. So that's another thing that we simplify with Gloo Platform. So let's have a look at that in action. So I'm going to just update my workspace settings for Bookinfo. You remember I import services from the gateway workspace, and I export to the gateway workspace the product page and the review services. But here I'm going to enable service isolation and trim proxy config, and I'm going to show you what this second option does in a minute. So if I create this here, automatically we will see that a lot of authorization policies have been created by the platform. You can see like for my 4 services that I have in this workspace, and I can see that the product page has been exported to the gateway workspace. So all the identities, so you remember this PFI ID, right? So the cluster, the namespace, and the service account name. So all the service accounts of my namespaces in the Bookinfo workspace, and all the service account of the namespaces of my gateway workspace can access the product page service. But if I look at the ratings, for example, I can see it's only the service account of my Bookinfo services because I didn't export that one. So that's good, and that means that now I have all my security in place by just changing a parameter in my workspace settings. But as I said, if you are in permissive mode, someone who is not in the mesh could still access my services. That's why what is done as well by the platform is creating these peer authentication objects automatically, so that in a granular fashion, right, service by service, we define that we want to have this strict mutual TLS. So it's not going to impact the other services in the other workspaces. So you can decide one workspace is ready to apply zero trust, they can do it now, they don't need to wait for the other ones to be ready and so on. And the last thing we do is an optimization, which is that we create something we call Sidecar objects. So it allows the control plane, so Istio D, to know that it should configure Envoy in a way that each proxy only is aware of how to reach out to these other services it is allowed to reach out to. So it's an optimization. Right? Instead, if I have like 1,000 services in my cluster, instead of having each proxy configured to talk to 999 other services, it's going to be configured to only talk to the one it is allowed to. So it's going to use less memory, less resources, and so on. So automatically all these things are provided by these options that I have set in my workspace settings, and I can validate that. So if I try to access my review service from a service that is not in the mesh, is going to be rejected because MTLS is mandatory and it cannot establish this mutual TLS communication. And for the other one that is in the mesh but is not a service that is allowed to talk to reviews because it's not even part of any workspace right now, so it cannot be even in any import or export rules, then I receive an explicit 403, right? Like an access denied. I'm not allowed to access this request based on these authorization policy. So you can really very easily set up zero trust using this workspace abstraction, but you can also decide that you want to be more fine-grained because you don't want all the services in the workspace to communicate together. You remember here, for example, you can configure it in a way that, okay, I don't want all the services to communicate in any order because ratings should not be accessed by product page directly, for example. So in that case, you can create these access policies, and here I say I want only the gateways to be able to access the product page service, and I can create another access policy where I say I want only the product page to be able to access details and reviews, and finally you can create another one where you say I want only only reviews to be able to access ratings, right? So you can validate that all the services that are supposed to have access to the other ones can have access to it, right? So for example, here we run multiple commands that shows that from product page to details that should be allowed, from reviews, product page to reviews that should be allowed, but from product page to ratings that should be denied, which is the case. And if I look at my authorization policies, I can see now it's more fine-grained, right? Like for example, this one, reviews, right, can be accessed only by the product page service, either running on cluster 1 and cluster 2, right? But it's not like any services in the workspace that can communicate together. So you can really start enabling zero trust very easily at the workspace level without having to create hundreds or thousands of rules. And then if you have some cases where you want to be more fine-grained, you can easily do that with these access policies.